This is Authentic. Now a special episode of the F-22 series, Balloon Busting. All right, welcome back everybody. This is a special episode in the F-22 series about the Chinese balloon shootdown that happened on February 4th, 2023. And we're recording this about a month after the fact. I'm your host, Scott, and along with me is your other host, Scar. How you doing today, Scar?
Hey, Scott. Great. I'm doing fine. How you doing today?
I'm doing great, and I'm excited to talk about this because it was a pretty big moment, I think, in current events. And looking back in future days, I think it may be a benchmark in a whole bunch of different things. But saying that, let's go ahead and talk about what we're actually going to talk about today.
Yeah, absolutely. So as everybody was tracking from about a month ago, there was a Chinese balloon that entered United States airspace in Alaska, the Aleutian Islands, followed the jet stream up into Alaska, then down into Canada, back into the continental United States, and then crossed from Montana, essentially following the jet stream over to South Carolina. On the 4th of February, that balloon was shot down by the mighty F-22 Raptor, instilling that fear into the hearts of all of our enemies. And so what we want to talk about is how did that aircraft get used in that way? Why did we use the Raptor? What are some of the tactical considerations that go into the leveraging of the Raptor and its capabilities? How did command and control get the Raptor into the spot to take the shot? What are the authorities and where do those come from? And ultimately the recovery of the wreckage of the balloon and what that could mean. Ultimately, I reached out on behalf of everybody here to try and get people on, and rightfully so, based on the international intrigue surrounding this, we were unable to get participants, and I don't blame them. But what I can do is give you, from my perspective, as a guy who flew with all the guys who took those shots over the last month, what they were thinking, some considerations, and ultimately, as we think about this podcast in the Raptor Show series, we don't necessarily need to be the first with the news, but we'll be the best with the analysis. And so excited to talk about that today, Scott.
Yeah, you are spot on there. Not the first to press, but we're going to bring you the best and most accurate info. I think I think the DoD's point is spot on that we're back in great power competition, and there's a lot of bad things to, personally identifying these guys. So, we could be proven wrong in 6 months. I don't know, but I think the listener's about to get the best information they possibly can on how this went down. But before we get to the event itself, let's set the scene for the listener, because it has been a long time. So my entire career, plus the 10 years or more since I retired, that we've really been talking about a daily concern from foreign powers coming into the airspace of the United States. So let's jump into the Wayback Machine, if you will, and start talking about the organizational structure of how we defend American airspace.
Absolutely, Scott. So the principal Homeland Defense Organization is one of the major combatant commands. So there are 11 combatant commands in the United States. In what we are very familiar with over the last 20 years, certainly is CENTCOM, or Central Command. Mm-hmm. Then there is EUCOM for Europe, AFRICOM for Africa, INDOPACOM for the Pacific. But then we also have a unified command called Northern Command, or NORTHCOM. Based out of Colorado Springs, Colorado, they are in charge, along with our allies of Canada and Mexico, the defense of North America. In principle, when it comes to NORTHCOM, they were founded shortly after the September 11th attacks in 2002, actually April 25th of 2002, after the study of how we did or did not share intelligence and how we may need to restructure the organizations that support the defense of America, not just abroad, but also at home. NORTHCOM was created. And so its current leadership is a 4-star general, General Van Herk. He has multiple hats, one of which is Northern Command Commander. He also is in charge of NORAD. But then also, when you think about the various structures surrounding NORTHCOM and how does it get its information, and how does it flow the information out and about? Well, it certainly starts with the president. Ultimately, everything when it comes to the military, you have to go straight up to the top, the commander-in-chief, and we can talk about this at a different time, but we always have civilian control of the military. Through separation of powers and the Constitution, you will always have a civilian control of the military. Commander-in-chief is the president. That person then delegates much authority down to the Secretary of Defense. That is the congressionally approved via the Senate confirmation process, the overall top civilian leader, not the president of the entire DoD. That person then has the combatant commands that report to them. So you have the EUCOM commander, Indo-PACOM commander, and also the NORTHCOM commander. They report directly to the Secretary of Defense, and they tell him or her what is going on in the world from the DoD perspective and provide recommendations for the utilization and mobility of forces.
Right.
Now, if we think about the Northern Command, you got General Van Herk. The NORTHCOM is separated, at least in the air domain, into two sectors. Western Air Defense Sector, called WADS for short, because of course in the military we have to have an acronym, and then we have to say the acronym like a word.
That's right.
And so WADS, Western Air Defense Sector, and then EADS, which is the Eastern Air Defense Sector. Also broken up in there are the Alaskan Command. So 11th Air Force also has a role from Alaska, and they are in charge of some pretty awesome capabilities to include some far-reaching radars, etc., that can provide high levels of awareness of the air domain far away so we can prepare. And so as you work your way down, again, in summary, President, SecDef, NORTHCOM Commander, then goes to the various sectors, Western Air Defense Sector and Eastern Air Defense Sector, WADS and EADS, which I believe are separated by the Mississippi River. And then you flow down into the various units which are tasked to WADS and EADS and NORTHCOM for Homeland Defense. So we always have fighters sitting alert on both coasts, up in Alaska as well, that are ready to, if the alarm sounds, immediately take off, and they're armed, and they're ready to take kinetic action in the defense of the homeland as needed.
Awesome. Great breakdown of how that all works. Some little points for the listener who, if there's little questions coming up. So one of the other combatant commanders that was big over the past 20 years is SOCOM. And people might ask, well, where does that fit in? Because we've been talking about regions. Well, there's geographic combatant commanders and there's functional. So SOCOM's functional. We're really not discussing that here, but if that came up. And then people sometimes ask, well, wait a minute, what about the Joint Chiefs of Staff? Because I didn't really hear, Scar talk about how they fit into all this. And one of the sort of strange things is that since I think 86 and Goldwater Nichols, the service chiefs don't actually have operational control of combatant forces in the field.
That's exactly right. So that is a really good point there, Scott. So from a organized, train, and equip perspective, the service chiefs, so the chief of naval operations, the commandant of the Marine Corps, the chief of staff of the Air Force, the chief of space operations, and the chief of the Army, they actually don't have a go-to-war role.
Right.
They are organized, trained, and equip 4-stars that provide and present forces and equipment to support the needs of the combatant commands and those combatant commanders. And so you're exactly right. The Air Force, in particular here for the Raptor, organizes, trains, and equips a Raptor squadron to then be shared to a combatant commander in a time of need. And in this case here, that Raptor squadron and those individual pilots in those individual airplanes for this mission were turned over command and control-wise to the NORTHCOM commander, and they no longer actually were owned by the Air Force at that time.
Right. Same thing with ships going over to the Persian or Arabian Gulf, depending on how you want to call it. So just wanted to throw that out there for the listener. But I mentioned 86 and the Goldwater Nichols Act, and I'm only going to mention that again to say, all this structure came out of sort of a transition period from the end of World War II. The Air Force was established, and the military started to change over that time frame. And we had a Cold War structure, which really predicated the threats this whole system was designed to defend against. So, Scar, let's talk about that for a minute. What what did we used to defend against, and what was the core framework, if you will, that was then modified by Goldwater Nichols and then later by the establishment of Northcom?
Absolutely. So early on, the purposes of the Homeland Defense, if you think about back into the Cold War, what were we worried about? During that time, we were worried initially about bombers. And one of the initial expected avenues of approach for Homeland Defense was actually over the poles, over the North Pole in particular. And if you actually think about some of the old Cold War bases that have since been bracked or base realignment and closure, aka they don't exist any longer, a lot of them are actually along the northern border along Canada, because we wanted to present forces and present air intercept fighters to be able to get the Bear bombers or the other high threat Russian, or in this case Soviet era fighters. I think about the Foxbat, Foxhound, etc., that could go high, fast, and over the top, and then launch a ballistic missile or some other nuclear-tipped warhead in an unfortunate, attack on America. And so we had a lot of focus in the 50s and beyond until the fall of the Soviet Union on our northern avenue of approach, which is why we had to have Homeland Defense. And we also have, so feeding into that, a whole host of radars and other signals capabilities, principally in the RF spectrum in America as well as in Canada, that are looking to the north. But we also have some other things, not just air domain assets that we need to be worried about. We also have NORAD has a role when it comes to ICBM in sounding the warnings for incoming missiles that we perceive are shot from, in that case, the Soviet-era Russia. And so we certainly would be monitoring for tips and cues, or also known as indications and warnings of what would be happening in the Soviet mainland, so that we could provide the appropriate warning to people here in the States in case we had to duck and cover. If you can find on YouTube some of those old videos of the 50s and 60s of kids doing duck and cover drills, no kidding, because we were so worried about the nuclear attack from Soviet Russia, a lot of those indications, warnings go and would be funneled through Colorado Springs and then be passed through the appropriate the appropriate domestic authorities, and all the way to include if you live in an area like I do where you may have tornado sirens or whatnot, those could be repurposed as a warning sign for you to get under your desk at school, kid, and get ready for the incoming attack. And so there is actually a multi-decade lineage of high levels of capability in a Homeland Defense.
That sounds a little crazy now, sitting here in, a quarter of the way into the 21st century, duck and cover. But, you talked about the Bear bombers and, now the Russians, then the Soviets still operate these, enormous four turboprop bombers and reconnaissance aircraft. They don't really use them in the strategic bombing role anymore. But, we're talking about, the 1950s when before the ICBM was really in service or was in service in large numbers, and all sorts of debates you can go and Google, or you could read on the missile gap and the perception of the missile gap and so on and so forth. But you're talking about, 400 knot probably bombers coming over the pole, as you said, because that is the shortest route to get from Soviet Russia to Canada and the United States. So, back then, I don't know if it's still called this, but the distant early warning line, or DEW line up there, was, consisted of these radars you were talking about, the tracking stations, and watching for those. So duck and cover wasn't quite as crazy as it sounds in the day of intercontinental ballistic missiles, or even unconventionally delivered missiles. So I'll just throw it out there.
No, you're absolutely right. And if you you can find, even as recently as in the early 2000s, you could find military bases with placards over doors that say nuclear fallout shelter.
And
that harkens back to the Homeland threat. Everybody need to be ready. Where is your local cellar? Where's your local fallout shelter, so you can have at least some semblance of success of survival? And this is the whole point of Homeland Defense. And, we'll talk about this here a little bit later, but there is a major difference in tracking and engaging a Bear bomber, tracking and engaging an ICBM, than there is tracking and engaging a balloon.
Absolutely.
And so I think there's really some unique things to consider there when you think about homeland defense against something as rudimentary, weather dependent, slow, high altitude as a balloon.
Right. And I think we'll get into it that there's a huge difference between deciding how, when, and with what weapons to engage, World War III, if you will, and the risks you're willing to take to the civilian population and air traffic when you're engaging a single balloon that does not appear to be carrying an offensive payload. But we can get into that.
Absolutely.
So yeah, the one thing probably that I don't want to say the Cold War had going for it, but one thing the Cold War had going for it was relatively predictable, right? So the stakes were enormous. The stakes were well beyond anything we faced. Even now, probably. I don't think we're looking at hair triggers, and I know we're not looking at the volume of nuclear weapons. But to the point of Northcom coming about because of intelligence sharing problems, so on and so forth, there was a lot of question of what the threat was going to be. We would expend a lot of assets to determine what the capabilities of the threat were as the Bear moved to the Badger, moved to the Backfire, or as the various Soviet ICBMs came into existence, and they'd do the same thing to us. But we knew it was pretty much going to be an over the pole. We're looking for those launches from the silos. We're looking for other indications and warnings, and the Soviets are doing the same thing to us. But 2001 moved us into a mindset of asymmetric warfare, of unconventional threats, and that changed what we were looking for. And I think that starts to speak to the threat of the balloon. So let's look at some of these newer threats and what that's like to defend against.
Yeah, absolutely. When you think about some of these, where have we put a lot of our treasure and a lot of our technical progress? It's been in the exquisite capabilities. Our fighters have more and more layers of avionics, computer software, exquisite hardware layered into them. Just look at the B-21, its latest edition. It could be 6 to 7, depending on what number you're looking at. $100 million a copy, an exquisite asset to be sure. F-35, actually reasonable in holding its price, but an exquisite asset to be sure. The first couple of Raptors that came off the line were in the $200 to $300 million range, and then they came down to just north of 100. Exquisite capability. And a lot of that is right. We should be pivoting, or we should be posturing ourselves to get ready to take down some of the highest threat, most exquisite capabilities our adversaries have. But it has actually left a meaningful gap in the low tech, the low speed, the easily reproducible, or easily mass produced, I'll even say, capabilities that we need to focus on. And so this is not maybe Raptor related, but there's a huge push for counter small UASs. So you think about your DJI quadcopter, incredibly important for us to get after those and mitigating those threats, because a little quadcopter actually can take down a $600 million bomber if it gets ingested in the wrong way.
Right.
And so that is a major cost offset. And so you think about a balloon as well, because we're so worried about multi-billion-dollar satellites that may be orbiting overhead, or multi-$100 million J-20s that will be going over the Mach our way. Maybe the greatest thing they can do, and this is not me not telling the Chinese what to do, far be it from that, but it is readily apparent from what we saw that a low-tech something has a capability. Just look at the Ukrainian conflict right now.
Absolutely.
Low-tech has a role. And so typically you match like technology with like technology when you're looking to combat it. So when you think about a balloon, which is low-tech, and you have a fighter, which is high-tech, with missiles that are high-tech, it creates some unique challenges, actually, about getting after those threats.
Absolutely. And we seem to do this in the U.S. military, not to go off on too much of a tangent, but the 80s and 90s in the Gulf, and to this day, and I won't go into some of the more modern things because I think we'd hit OPSEC issues, but the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, they'd come out with their little boghammer speedboats, and they'd even had like jet skis with two guys on them, right? With dude on the back with an RPG, and we'd all sort of laugh And then I had a CSO, a combat systems officer, who looked at me and said, yeah, we all laugh until you send 100 of those guys and only one has to get lucky. And now our spy radar array is wrecked. And now the carrier's primary defense is wrecked. And this has been mitigated, so I'll talk about it because it was 80s or 90s. Navy surface ships at one point were sort of like the Death Star, right? If you go back to Star Wars and they're like, hey, Lord Vader, our turbo lasers can't hit these guys. They're too small and too fast. We're out there with our 5-inch guns going, yeah, I can't track something that small. And by the time the shell has reached them, they're gone. And so, like you said, we need to find different capabilities to deal with these things. And that's what makes them asymmetric.
Absolutely. And because we've put most of our work in our industrial base against tackling those high-end exquisite threats, those low-end commercial alterations, honestly, are where we maybe need to spend a little bit more time. And I think you do see that. You do see that in the major push for counter small UAS. I think there is going to be some unique looks at these low-tech capabilities. You just look at the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict from just over a year ago, the conflict that's going on actively in Ukraine. There are just tomes being written about these low-cost, lower-tech capabilities that can still play an outsized influence. And so I'm excited to see that we haven't lost the game of using our exquisite against inexquisite.
Right.
I'm not saying that I don't want the audience to think that because we only have exquisite, we have an overwhelming blind spot in the low tech. That is not the case.
No.
But what I am saying is that there is meaningful thought process and treasure allocation that should be put into these low tech capabilities.
Absolutely. So having said that, the balloon itself is a relatively low tech capability because, we could go back 100 years, more than 100 years, right? Balloons have been used in warfare with the same basic fundamental concept. Probably less change in a balloon since I think the mid 1800s, the French started using them on the battlefield. Probably less technological advance overall than in fixed wing aircraft.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You think about, we use them, and by we, I just mean America, used them in the Civil War. They were used for artillery spotting. You think about balloons in World War I were major sources of challenge. You look at pictures of the D-Day invasion prior to World War II. They had balloons over top of ships for protection purposes. And principally, a balloon is really just hotter, so lighter than air gas with a payload hanging from it.
Right.
And that payload may be of varied levels of exquisite capability, but in a general sense, you need to get something that's lighter than air with a payload hanging from it. It may or may not have its own propulsion capabilities, may or may not have its own power generation, but it's ranging from as low tech as the Remax balloon flying overhead to the Chinese balloon that we saw, to the Goodyear blimp at the Super Bowl. Is a deviation from the general balloon concept. And so these have a long and storied history of them being used.
So with that said, let's talk about this actual event that culminated on the 4th of February, 2023. And let's start by, Scar, tell us about what we can talk about on the unclass level, not touching OPSEC. When did we see it? What was it? And then what did we start doing about it?
Yep. So it is important to note, I am going to be referring to all open source news stories as we go through the timeline of the balloon. And so sometime in January, this balloon was put up into the air somewhere we assess in the Chinese mainland. If you look at a very varied websites online, you can actually map the jet stream of planet Earth right now, open source. And so you can see where the jet stream is today, where the forecast is expected to be in a few days, and you can actually see back data all the way to when it could have been launched or released, I'll say, from the Chinese mainland. So it was released from the Chinese mainland in early February. It made It made landfall in the Aleutian Islands off the coast of Alaska. So the Aleutians stretch far into the west off of Alaska towards the international date line. It then flew along the Aleutians, again, assessing the jet stream over the center of Alaska, and then it crossed into the Canadian border, at which point it pivoted from a general northeasterly trajectory with the jet stream back to the southeast, and then it crossed from Canada into the United States border somewhere around the end of January, the 1st of February. And so we were tracking it along those ways. We were monitoring it along that time as far as I can assess using, again, open source awareness. And then the first major potential kinetic action took place. We didn't kinetically connect with it, but we scrambled fighters from Nellis Air Force Base. So on the 1st of February, we scrambled a couple of Raptors from Nellis Air Force Base towards the to the north, so out of southern Nevada to Montana, got a good look at it, and ultimately came back home to Nevada. And so you think about the prep in order to do that. The Raptors that are sitting at Nellis are not armed all day long, and the ability to get the weapons on board, to include AIM-9Xs, AIM-120, and a gun, get the appropriate command and control architectures and people in place, get the intel, airspace, and authorities in place. That takes place a couple of days prior to that action. And so the guys at Nellis, using what I would assess from my experience, a couple of days prior to February 1st, knew that they were going to go.
Okay.
And so then they flew out of Nellis towards the balloon and then came back. As you can find on open source as well, the reason why that shot did not get taken was because we were worried about wreckage falling on people over the continental United States.
Right. I'm old enough that I will say I was alive, but have no memory of. There was something called Skylab, a space station back in the day that was going to come hurtling back to Earth. And if memory serves, and talking to my parents, like it was going to be like one of those disaster movies, right? It's get a hit, it's going to devastate a city, or it could just burn up and do nothing. But the point is, when planes crash, they tend to do damage on the ground, or they have a high potential to do damage on the ground. And as we know now, and we'll talk about in a little bit, there was a substantial payload suspended under this balloon. And I'm sure a lot of people are, oh, why didn't we shoot it down earlier? Well, as you just said, what's the risk, right? And I'm sure we'll talk about that here. We'll look at the risk, and I don't want to take us somewhere that you're not able to talk about, but I think we're also getting some goodness over just having that. The U.S., we're getting some goodness over through having that float over the United States and let us get a good long look at it.
No, I agree with you. In to your point, Scott, the risk was not zero.
Right.
I've heard you can find the Twitter pundits or other people who suddenly have an immense amount of authority on the matter say, "Hey, why didn't we just shoot it down over the ground?" There's quote unquote perceived minimal population over Montana, and so at the risk of this certainly not becoming a political statement at all, the risk was not zero.
Right.
And so to your point, they decided to let it continue to float on its current path, with us now, continuing to have full awareness of it.
Right.
To include, now that has come out since the balloon crossing the United States, that awesome YouTube photo of the U-2 selfie, essentially. I've got some friends who fly the U-2 actively.
Nice.
And essentially there's nothing better than flying right alongside that balloon with the shadow of the U-2 on the material of the balloon. I can only imagine a smile on the face. Yeah. And so how great was that picture, Scott?
Oh, it's terrific. And we'll put that up for the listeners to see on our site. But, the other risk I've heard the experts, and they're all out there, right? They're all out there. They seem to come out on every issue on social media. I did not realize that I wasted my college career and my time at the War College to learn some of this stuff, because I could have just gotten on Twitter and others and known just as much. But, I've heard what if it did have a nuke? What if it did have an EMP? And, this is part of what command and control goes to. Like, is that theoretically possible? Yeah, I guess so. And I haven't done analysis of what it was, but for the listener, that's what the National Command Authority, I know we don't use that term anymore. I'm showing my dinosaur term, but that's what the NCA does, right? They assess the threat because it makes no sense for China or any other peer threat. And because we were pretty sure we knew where this came from, it made no sense to launch a single nuke and blow it up over the United States for an EMP, electromagnetic pulse, for the if you don't know what that is, or just as a nuclear attack. And there is sort of a bit of a history there of good decisions being made during the Cold War to avoid bad situations. I think the most famous, and maybe we'll do a historical piece on this at one point, is a Soviet colonel who was essentially the watch officer at their NORAD when all their computers said, the Americans have launched. And he said, this makes no sense. This makes absolutely no sense. And he didn't take the immediate actions that could have led to a full-scale Soviet launch. And it turned out he was right. So there's thought that goes into this. It's not just inaction. And as you said, we're not making this political. So I'm not taking a side on, this administration should have done that or another administration would have done. No, look, guys, the military assessment was there's no point in the low risk of shooting it down because, there's low risk, there's lowly populated areas. But if you're the one person it falls on, that was 100% risk to you. So, or, your house or your anything else.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Scott. There's actually a wonderful documentary. I believe it's called The Fog of War.
Okay.
It details Robert McNamara when he was the Secretary of Defense, and this was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Mm-hmm. And he essentially, there's a quote, I'll paraphrase, where he says, perfectly rational people were inches away from ending the world. Mm-hmm. And you also say, to your point, or they weren't. Like in this case here, there is zero, or we assess with high confidence the low threat of a nuclear or EMP or other payload on board this air vehicle, which is what it was. Right. And for those listening, when you think about intel assessments, if you ever receive an intel brief, you get they will say something could happen. We'll call it A could happen, and they assess it with high confidence, medium confidence, or low confidence. And so in an intel assessment of what is the payload on board this balloon or hanging from the balloon, we would assess with high confidence that it is not something of mass destructive nature.
Right.
And so that is important to note. Yeah. I think you made some great points there, Scott.
All right. I appreciate that. So, all right. So we've talked about what we were pretty sure it wasn't. We talked about the opportunity we had to look at what it was. And, if we edge too close to anything, let me know here, Scar. But for example, in my time in the Navy, we had what were called wartime reserve modes on all of our emitters, which were things we would not use except for in time of war. And that's because we didn't want to give, at the time, primarily the Soviets, an idea of some of the frequencies we might use or some of the technologies we might use in an actual conflict. Because, of course, then you can program against that. And I bring that up to say there is a lot of goodness in being able to not just watch this thing visually, but to monitor it across the entire spectrum, see what it may or may not be doing, and get some really good information there.
I 100% agree. As there was some cynicism, whether you agree or disagree with letting it float across the country, there is no better place for us to take some toys out of the warehouse and utilize in order to gather information on something than over America. And so I would just say, I imagine that we found out a lot about the balloon during that time.
Exactly. So with that being said, let's talk about the day itself, right? So the first intercept is made out of Nellis over sort of the north central U.S., and the decision's made not to take the shoot down there. And then there's some more decision making that culminates on 4 February. What happened there, Scar?
Absolutely. So you got to think about the track of the air vehicle, the balloon itself. Where do we expect it to go? What assets are in the vicinity in order to support a potential kinetic action? And as was alluded to a couple days prior, President Biden had said that he gave the order when it was safe to take the shot on the balloon. And so now it's over the continental United States. The perceived lowest risk to any falling debris hitting somebody on the ground would be now let's get it over the water, which is going to be the Atlantic Ocean.
Mm-hmm.
So now you think, what is the asset that can best take this shot? Well, now you got to think about the target itself. So working from the target backward, we have a balloon. We assess it's in the 55 to 65,000 foot range as far as altitude, so certainly up in the stratosphere. It is going to be flying at somewhere between 0 and 150 knots along with the wind. So I've been up in the jet stream. If you've ever flown an airplane, you also have flown in the jet stream, and that will add or subtract potentially up to 150 or so miles an hour from your ground speed based on the direction and the velocity of the wind. And so you have to have an aircraft that can get up to that altitude in order to take a verified visual shot on this thing, because that's what we want to do. We want to get as reasonably close in proximity to have a good valid shot. And now you go, okay, what is that asset? Well, in this case here, we're going to float it over the East Coast, and the best asset in order to have reasonable levels of maneuverability while carrying the kinetic weapons required is going to be the F-22. If you think about the East Coast, you have C model Eagles, you have E model Strike Eagles, you have Super Hornets, you have F-16s, and you have a whole host of tankers. And ultimately, what's going to take the kinetic shot? You also have F-35s. I shouldn't forget those of all the variants. So, what is going to be the best asset? Well, to have the greatest maneuverability, the greatest speed, and the ability to connect kinetically with it, the F-22 was chosen. Why was the F-16? Why was the Strike Eagle? Why was the Super Hornet not chosen? I would say, from my experience, it is because it was going to be a little bit harder for them to get up and stable at altitude in order to take the shot level as close as you could to the balloon itself. There are some who have said, hey, well, if that is true, they may not have the greatest maneuverability or capability up high. Couldn't they just point their nose up and take the shot pointing up? That may or may not work based on the angle of the sun. You also are fleeting and taking that shot. You have to pull your nose back down in order to continue to have the follow-up as required. It is best tactically in order to be level with this balloon.
Right.
The other thing to consider, too, would be the sensors on board, because this thing could actually be moving at 0 knots. Believe it or not, that is reasonably challenging for something flying at 0.9 Mach to take care of. And so there are, without getting into some mitigations or other things, I'll just say from a radar theory perspective, something moving at somewhere between, and you can't plan on it quite exactly, 0 to 100 some knots is very challenging for sensors on board to take care of, radar in particular.
Right. Low, slow flyers have been a problem for air defense forever. And just a couple things really quickly. I'll ask the question for the non-pilot question. Obviously the F-22 comes into land and it can go slower than 150 knots to do that, but you can't do that at altitude, right? You need enough velocity to generate enough lift. So this is one of the problems you have, right?
Absolutely. You are looking at, to be in the 50s in order to have reasonable maneuverability on the jet, you've got to be over the Mach.
Okay.
And so if you think about, can a Strike Eagle, an F-16, a Super Hornet sustain for reasonable amounts of time, because we may want to take a couple of swings at the bat, a couple of flybys of this thing, get above the Mach for maneuverability up high. The Raptor was designed for this.
Right.
The Raptor was designed back starting actually in the early 70s. We'll get into the history of this later, but the early 70s and 80s, and then first flew, and that was against some high, fast threats. And so the aircraft was meant to go high, fast. It just loves it up there. And so this is a great example of why the Raptor was a good platform by which to take the shot. So you're exactly right there, Scott.
The other thing is, I'm sure people might ask about, okay, you talk about having to pull the nose up for the shot, and then it's a transient, sight picture, we'd call it in my background. And some might say, well, what about off-axis shots? I think you already hit that you want the best possible perspective on this. This is not a snapshot in a dogfight. You have time to set it up correctly. So set it up correctly, right?
Exactly right, Scott. And if you, in some of the videos that have come out since of people looking up at the ground, I mean, this thing was made for TV, Scott. It was amazing
Yeah.
to watch. It was like awesome. You can see that the contrails of the shooters, the jets, the Raptors. You take a second, line it up. There's no threat. Take the moment to get lined up on azimuth at the altitude, stable airspeed, and get yourself ready, because the closure is a problem.
Mm-hmm.
If you're flying at Mach 1.1 up at 55,000 feet, and this thing is potentially flying at 0 because the wind died, that is moving very quickly towards you. And so having a second to line it all up, take a breath, and take the shot is incredibly important.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so we started talking about the aircraft we used to shoot it down, and I think we'll come back to maybe the weapons and why those weapons were used. But this is a lot more than scramble. I think the Franco 1 and Franco 2, right? Back to Frank Luke.
It was yep. So the aircraft that took the shot was Frank 01, and then Frank 02 was backing him up, and then there was also a Luke 01 and a Luke 02 who were airborne as well, and that harkens back to Frank Luke Jr., Medal of Honor winner, also known as the Arizona Balloon Buster, who flew with the 27th Pursuit Squadron out in the Lafayette Escadrille, and the 27th Pursuit Squadron turned into, ultimately now, 100 years later, is the 27th Fighter Squadron, and that is where these guys flew out of.
Yeah. And so, I think most people in the military and a lot of Americans too, just like that sort of heritage, that link back, because, Frank Luke shot down a number of balloons back in World War I, as you were talking about. So that's a little bit of a cool note. And then, okay, it's an F-22 against a balloon. Why are there 2? Why are there 4? Well, because 2 is 1 and 1 is none whenever anything goes wrong, right? So you always want redundancy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You're exactly right. And the importance of getting this shot right necessitated in taking it down at the time that we needed to, necessitated it being taken, or it requiring a couple of backup aircraft. And I should know, I misspoke. It's the 27th Aero Squadron, not the 27th Pursuit Squadron. Pursuit Squadrons were later, but 27th Aero, came late. Yep, you're exactly right.
Yeah, nice. But in addition to those guys, there were all sorts of assets up there. And just to, set that up for the listener, we said a little bit earlier, this isn't World War III. This is not, here come regiments of Soviet bombers over the pole and get up there and shoot them down no matter what. There's civilian air traffic crisscrossing the United States. And I'll go off on a tangent here for a minute, but having sortied on 9/11 on my destroyer, one of the spookiest things, it was like walking through a radar ghost town, was watching our Aegis picture, and there was nothing flying in the United States except for 2 circles over New York and 2 circles over Washington, D.C., which were capped. And that's a little like, pick your favorite zombie show, right? And you see the picture of the highway with absolutely nothing on it, right? This is LA I-5 rush hour with nothing on it. But that's how busy our airways normally are, right? If you go look at them, there's planes flying everywhere. And we just couldn't take that chance. It would have been foolish to sort of shoot from the hip on this one. So we had to have assets out there to make sure the range was clear, if you will. We had to have the assets up there to make sure that the Frank flight and Luke flight could stay up. So what kind of planes were up there, and what other non-aviation assets were watching this?
This actually goes right into that overall civil military coordination for Homeland Defense that's orchestrated by Northern Command, as we described. And so as the balloon floated to the east, the custody was transitioned to the Eastern Air Defense Sector. Using the Eastern Air Defense Sector, they are piped into the ATC feeds, the radars, a whole host of other capabilities. They are tracking the balloon. And so in that coordination of military capabilities, they are collaborating with the civil authorities who ultimately own the airspace. If you're flying in America, this airspace is owned by the FAA, which is a civilian organization, civilian administration, right? And so you can't just take that shot, like you said, if you have a whole host of airliners around. So now you have to go through the appropriate procedures and processes with the FAA, collaborating with the military to clear it out of the way. How they did that this time is they actually ground stopped and activated airspace off the coast of South Carolina. So they stopped all commercial arrivals, departures, and other civil air traffic in and around the Charleston area. Mm-hmm. And they activated airspace off the coast of Charleston for national security purposes. So that is the military in concert with the FAA throwing the ultimate card on the table and saying, clear it out.
Right.
Nobody's going in there. All IFR traffic, so instrument flight rules traffic, that's like your Deltas, your Uniteds, your et ceteras. They have to be vectored around the airspace to make it sanitized. And if there was a Cessna that decided to take off and fly without talking to anybody, they would be intercepted and appropriately, directed to go somewhere else outside of this area. How you know whether it's active or not is told to you via the NOTAMs, which are notices to air mission, which are put out by the FAA every day and updated continuously. And also, if you're talking to air traffic controller ATC, they will be telling you about hazards in your way. So the assets are ground-based. First, clearing out the airspace, working, and these are bureaucratic offices working with the FAA to stop launch, ground stop, nobody's flying. And I apologize to anybody who's listening who was delayed out of Charleston getting in or out during that time. That was for a high priority mission, as you know.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, if you were on that ground stop, I'm sure it was irritating, but when you think about the alternate potential, it was probably a better option.
Yeah, and I wonder if you were sitting on an airplane during ground stop in Charleston, if you took the TV in the back headrest of the seat in front of you and you turned it to one of the major cable news networks, you would be able to watch it live, as you're sitting there. So you could have full awareness of, what's going on.
That's right. Unlike normally when you're just like, why am I stuck here? Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's right. So there's a ton of ground-based asset, right? Ground-based capabilities going on in order to clear this out. But when it comes to airborne, I don't know factually, Scott, whether there was an E3 or an E2 airborne. So E3 would be the AWACS, and the E2, which is the naval variant of airborne command and control. I do not know if those were airborne or not, but I do know tankers were airborne. And so the Raptors took off, and there were tankers available, which they did utilize in order to have the greatest ability to flex and to hang out, to loiter, to adapt. And so orchestrating and pre-planning those alert tankers to get airborne, get into their cap in an appropriate location that's meaningful for those fighters to appropriately intercept. Those were all underway. And so the dance, the mission planning and coordination from the ground and air had to be right in order to make this happen. There's a multi-miracle solution that took place in order for this shot to take place, and we all saw it on live TV.
Right. I will take an educated guess that there was an E3 probably up, and maybe even more than one, possibly an E2, because I know there's subtle differences in how they work and what they can do. But just an airborne radar gives you, from a guy who used to do air defense planning, right, on the naval side, there are just aspects to airborne radars that you can't get on a ground-based radar. So I'm going to guess they did not do without any capability in the U.S. arsenal to make sure this went off right.
That very well could be, Scott. As of this moment, that very well could be. You're exactly right.
And again, we'll just remind the listener, we're giving you the best analysis that's available. So if it's not confirmed out there open source, we're not going to tell you it happened, and we're not going to speculate on things if we heard back channel and try and imply it to you either. That's we're not going to do either one of those things, because the operational security of our active forces is always paramount.
You're exactly right, Scott.
So we talked about why the F-22. We talked about how they got there. Why the 9X? You're coming up on a balloon. I think the casual thought would be the more holes in that thing, the better. Why don't we use the gun, right? I know it's not quite that simple, and then the other piece, and I think we talked about this in our episode 0 lead-in just a little bit, is, wait, an infrared missile against a balloon with no propulsion source? What's going on here?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. So let's do a quick 30 seconds on the armament of the Raptor to level set.
Yep.
So from an air-to-air perspective, it can carry up to 6 AIM-120s. Those are AMRAAMs, Advanced Medium Range Air-to-Air Missile, Radar-Guided Missile, all internal. It can carry up to 2 AIM-9s of both the Mike and X variety, which actually have meaningful differences, but those are internal in the side weapon space. And then it also, from an air-to-air perspective, has the M61A2 Gatling gun shooting. It carries internally 480 rounds of 20 millimeter lead. And so, America, let's take this down. What are we going to do? And so there are a bunch of strengths and weaknesses to each of those. And let's talk about the gun first. So the gun could be a meaningful capability, but I believe there were some studies done and actually a real life test done, I think in Canada, that demonstrated that you could shoot at a balloon, but many of these balloons have material which doesn't just shred. It may actually have puncture prevention. And so even if you shot a bunch of holes in it, now you took that balloon and you just let a little air leak.
Right.
And now that little air leak is going to allow it to continue to be in the jet stream. And that little air leak could take potentially days for it to fall out of the sky.
Right.
And so you now have, I'm not saying the gun wouldn't eventually have brought that thing down, but I'm just saying it may not have been the best solution against this particular threat, right? You want to use the tool that's best for the threat that you're engaging. And in this case, there are many things or many ways that I, salivate sitting here at using my gun against. The balloon.
Balloon is not one of them. Yeah.
Excuse me. That's right.
Yeah. For you avid movie watchers, Hollywood is not your friend. Things do not blow up when they're shot, by the way. And most especially for those of you who don't recall from history lessons, the Hindenburg, pretty much every lighter than air aircraft has moved to something that is non-explosive, non-flammable because of that. So yeah, I'm sure the argument, what about the tracer? What did it? No, gas tanks do not blow up in cars when you shoot them.
Yep.
Airplanes do not blow up because the gas tank was hit. They actually blow up if the fumes are ignited. We could go down that route. But anyway, yeah. So the gun is not a great option here.
Yep, absolutely. Now let's talk about the AMRAAM. The AMRAAM is an interesting option, but not quite sure about the radar reflectivity of that of the balloon. Not quite sure the radar reflectivity of the material that's carrying the gas. And so, not to say people who listen to me go, "Oh my gosh, it had solar panels. Of course, it had a major radar cross section." I'm not saying it did or it didn't, but it relies on the ability to sustain a meaningful radar lock, and then the little bitty radar on the front end of that missile has to also be able to see it. And so there are some interesting considerations in that regard. And so ultimately it may be a more meaningful tool against this threat than the gun certainly was, but maybe not the best tool to be used again against a balloon. I will again sit here and say there are a number of amazing things I would love to have shot down with an AMRAAM. Balloon may not be the best in that case. For if you think about the radar signature, there may be some considerations there. And then finally, you have the AIM-9. Our CAF units, or Combat Air Force units, frontline units of the Raptor, are all equipped with AIM-9X. The AIM-9X, again, you can find on open source, is an imaging seeker. And so it uses the IR band of the electromagnetic spectrum in order to see hot or cold things up in the sky and the temperature deltas between those. And so in a very general sense, you can also see in your HUD where the missile is tracking. And so in this case here, with the threat that you have and the tools at your disposal, you have the ability with an AIM-9X to visually verify in your HUD that it is looking at what you think it is looking at, in order to say with confidence as you hit the pickle button that this missile is guiding on what I want it to actually guide on.
Right.
And so this is why this missile was chosen for this particular threat as the tool of choice.
Right. And again, we go back to take your time, take the right shot. All these things, starting with the ground coordination, the ground stop, through the choice of the AIM-9X, are because every disaster that has ever happened has been because of a string of events. And if any link in that chain doesn't happen, then the disaster doesn't happen. But can you imagine if something goes wrong and you shoot down the dude in the Cessna, right? You shoot down the airliner that didn't get the ground stop. Not that that would happen, but this is why all of these things happen. Oh, you don't need a ground stop because you got the radar controllers keeping them clear. Oh, because no, you do all these things because one thing goes wrong and it's disastrous.
100% agreed. Again, please do not take what I'm saying as the AIM-9X is the only tool for a balloon.
Oh, of course.
It 100% is not. We could have used the gun, could have used the AMRAAM. Right. But for all of these various, again, like nebulous considerations that we pay our fighter pilots to think about and consider, the optimum solution for this threat was to use the AIM-9X. And as everybody saw in the video, it was a one and done.
Right.
So that as you can see, the missile guided on not the material that was holding the gas, but the actual payload underneath, made kinetic impact, and then that is what took the balloon down. First shot, first kill.
So, and let's, within the realm of open source, the warhead, people might say, okay, so you hit the payload, what about the balloon? Well, what's the warhead on that AIM-9X? And in some ways, maybe hitting the payload is the optimal detonation point to take down that balloon envelope.
Yeah, absolutely. You have the payload that is hanging from a trapeze of wires to the balloon. That is also essentially, those wires provide a lot of the structural integrity to hold the balloon in place. And you can find, again, open source, how missiles detonate is they have fragmentary pieces inside. So as the missile explodes, it essentially is not just the missile itself, but the pieces all around it, shotgun shelling. It's a buckshot that peppered the balloon, peppered the payload, and ultimately resulted, as you saw, it immediately losing all structural integrity, immediately starting to fall to the ground.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, the fragmentation warheads, whether they're continuous rod or unitary blast with fragmentation, whatever they are, you're getting a lot of jagged pieces that are tearing large holes rather than the gun, which is punching discrete holes in that.
It's a lot of frag. I'll just say the missile itself, everything. There's a lot of frag associated with it. Yep.
Right, and then by taking out some of that support structure, the actual stresses on the balloon tear itself apart to some degree.
Yes, absolutely. And so when you think about a hot air balloon or any other balloon, those wires or ropes, etc., that pull down, that actually keeps that material in the shape you want it to float. Mm-hmm. And so the moment you disrupt those wires, those ropes, etc., so I'm calling it the trapeze of support wire, that is suspending the payload and connecting it to the material, the balloon itself. As soon as that is disrupted, then the structural integrity of the entire thing falls apart.
Right. All right. So decisions made. We've discussed how, where, why, when, and now we've shot it down. And as you said, we shot it down in the safest place we could, which was over water, just off the coast, just off the Carolinas. And then we moved to recover it. And, one other factor I think that potentially could have played in here, and we do know it's open source who went and recovered it, EOD units out of Little Creek. And I'm very familiar with Little Creek and with the EOD forces there, the dive teams. If this was going to happen anywhere in or around the continental U.S., there's one or two places that are optimal for recovery, and this was one of them. So you could go look that up, and there's pictures out there, and you can see all the forces arrayed. And this is a episode about the F-22, so we won't get into the amphibs and the boat units and such. But we sent some guys out there to recover. So what do we know has been recovered as far as open source?
Yeah, open source. We can say that talk about the Raptors first. The Raptors safed it up, so they moved their master arm switch from hot to safe. They then brought themselves back home. They flew back to Langley, and then debriefed appropriately, what went right, what went wrong, and then provided that op rep or the operations report, intel assessment of what actually happened, what they saw, felt, and in overall the engagement itself. So what was left? As you can see from the videos, from live TV and what has come in the months since the shot, there was quite a bit of damage that was done. But what we did recover is the balloon material itself. We've recovered some of the hardware. We have, I generally don't know whether we've recovered meaningful microprocessors, batteries, the golden piece of Intel itself. But I'll say, even though it did do quite a bit of damage, in the same way that people can reconstruct aviation accidents from just little bits that are left over, little bits of this balloon, and really the hardware itself that was the payload. Those, we have amazing sleuths within the DoD and the civilian world that, from little pieces and clues, can put a lot together.
Right.
And so I imagine that we have learned a lot from the bits and pieces that we have found since it was recovered.
Absolutely. You don't need the entirety of something, though it's nice. It's nice to have the entirety of something, and there's some really interesting history of a whole bunch of different platforms that a little bit of information takes you down the wrong route. I'm looking at you, MiG-25. But, you can do a lot from these little pieces. And as far as, what was recovered, you're talking about sort of the golden bullet of intel out there. I don't anticipate any of us are going to know on the outside, if you will, for a long number of years. If you're interested in some concepts behind that, go look up Project Azorian. If you're not familiar with it, the Glomar Explorer. Maybe we can do a show on that at some point and talk about that. But if anyone tells you, I know what it was, just can't tell you about it, well, they probably shouldn't even be saying that if they actually do know.
Yep. No, you're exactly right. And so I think there will be continued analysis, probably some information shared over the next couple of months as we continue to go through some more declassification processes. But there's still a lot to be learned out there.
Yep. Fair enough. All right, Scar. Well, that was the February 4th shoot down of the confirmed Chinese balloon. We do know that there were a couple other shoot downs of balloons right after that. And we're not really going to talk about those on this episode. We'll mention them, and we'll mention how the Chinese balloon shoot down affected those. Let's start there, right? Because as you said, those pilots immediately came down, and like any good, military organization, AAR'd after action reported it.
You're exactly right, Scott. So as I alluded to, there's an op rep, you debrief, you download your tapes, you get all your sensor data. And the most important thing that we can do is share those lessons learned throughout the Raptor community, which is actually not that big. And so the other Air Force Raptor or the other Raptors that are on alert are up in Alaska. And so a couple days later, again, through the sharing of that information, I know there were calls between the two, data shared. You now have another balloon that pops up off the north coast of Alaska. And so they take that shot. Now Raptor has the second balloon. And then very shortly thereafter, over Canada, the Raptor has the third. And the most important thing, again, I'm not going to get into were those Chinese balloons or what style or whether they were threats or whatnot, but ultimately what it detailed was the successful information sharing after an engagement, which is the most important thing we do in the military, is get it after the lessons learned. And if there's an organization in the DoD that prides itself on not playing I Have a Secret, in sharing all the lessons so that you can ensure the lethality and survival of your bros around you, is the fighter community. Certainly the Raptor is an exemplar of that mentality. So I learned something, I took that shot and immediately tell everybody, this is what I saw. And the most important thing you can say is what I did wrong. So here's where I flew my jet inappropriately. Here's where I used my sensors inappropriately. I maybe took the shot in a less optimal way than what I should have. All those lessons learned are immediately propagated throughout the entire Raptor force. And so now you can easily see how those were leveraged in those next couple shots. It's really amazing to see, Scott. It is a testament to the professionalism and honestly how proud I am of my friends who are still flying the jet and what they were able to do.
Absolutely, because as you said, let's set aside the intel on those, what they may or may not have been. There is open source, but who really knows, right? Because you could say the open source is exactly right, and you could say the open source is what we are going to let go in open source. I don't know. We don't know, and it's immaterial to the discussion we're having here. To me, the point is, like you said, we did an intercept out of Nellis on this first balloon. We did a consummated intercept off the Carolinas. It was a really big deal. And then we do 2 after that in rapid succession. And they're almost sort of nothing burgers, right? I don't mean that in terms of what got shot down. I mean, it was like, oh, well, these guys figured it out. They shared the lessons learned. And now it's just another day in the office, when your office happens to be the cockpit of an F-22. But it's another day in the office, and we learned how to do it, and we went out and we did it as professionals.
No, you're exactly right. And it really is a great low-threat dress rehearsal of what we hope will never come, which is a conflict using the Raptor in a meaningful way.
Right.
Where that first, those first engagements, those guys who come home, they're immediately going to tell everybody what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And then the guys who take off after them are going to be smarter.
Right.
And the guys who follow them are going to be smarter and that much more lethal.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is really one of the best things that could have been done, is that we got to practice these real world skills here in America. Low threat, but it's now putting more tracks on that path for that sharing of information, that increasing of lethality, in order to make us that much more capable.
Absolutely. Because I think the one thing we can say with some degree of certainty is, as the world changes and our geopolitical situation changes, the threats to the continental United States are not going away, and they're not reducing. They're just going to increase in complexity. They're going to increase in potentially quantity. I mean, if you go back and look at the Cold War, the number of intercepts that air defense, I guess ADC back at the time was flying,
that's right,
I think would boggle some people's minds today. Like how often the Soviets were pushing our boundaries, and honestly, how often we were pushing theirs. So, sort of a good opportunity to step back into that, maybe dip your toe in the water, if you will, right before you take the plunge.
Absolutely. It is a great, this was not practice. We kinetically connected with an adversary aircraft, honestly.
Right.
So I won't call this practice, but it was the lowest threat opportunity for us to demonstrate command and control architectures, all the way, it really just a kill chain.
Right.
From initial tips and cues all the way to the kinetic connection. It was an opportunity for us to exercise the entire system. Yeah. And I'm really happy that Raptor was a part of it.
Of course. Yeah. All right. Well, is there anything we've forgotten? Anything we need to talk about? Give the listener.
No, Scott, I really appreciate the opportunity to share what my thoughts are as a former Raptor driver, what I would be thinking, what would be leading up to making sure I was successful. And it really is the success of the pilots in the Raptor is not about them. It's about protecting and securing America. And so our ability to participate in that is really important. And I'm glad we were able to demonstrate that on the world stage. Even just a little degree of shooting a balloon down. Ha ha. At least we still were able to demonstrate the capabilities. So I appreciate the opportunity to share.
Absolutely. And to your point, it was maybe a harder shot than taking down a manned bomber that's coming in at high speed. So let's, I know there's a lot of ha-ha out there, but, not so much. Not so much. It was not the easiest thing in the world to do.
This is not a yawner of a problem, Scott. Shooting it down a balloon is not a slouch, as much as armchair quarterbacks may want to say that. And so I'm happy to share the story, and thanks for giving me the opportunity, and I look forward to the next one.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, speaking of that, look forward to us in the future. Scar and I are going to be back, and we'll be interviewing some other F-22 pilots about the F-22 program itself. So be looking out for that. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the F-22 series on Authentic.